At the basis of the whole modern view of life, wrote Wittgenstein, lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. Heraclitus would probably have agreed. The laws of nature are constructs of considerable power to describe the universe. They hold universally through the whole of time and space. They hold consistently and are altered if any exceptions emerge. They are thus falsifiable and are constantly tested. And they reduce a vast range of phenomena to a few theorems that human minds can compass. This is something indeed, but it is only description. And besides the need to describe the world, stands the need to interpret it. Heraclitus was a philosopher, and the goal of philosophy is not knowledge, but understanding. The Milesians were scientists of a sort, and it is usual to study Heraclitus alongside them at the dawn of rationalism. This approach does at first seem promising. Heraclitus rejects the authority of those founts of traditional Greek wisdom, Homer and Hesiod, as well as that of more recent claimants, such as Archilochus, Xenophanes, Hecataeus, and Pythagoras. Then he explicitly supports the claims of sense experience. The things of which there is seeing and hearing and perception, these do I prefer, tau ta ego protimeo. And yet, on the whole, the evidence of the other fragments seems to suggest that Heraclitus was no cosmologist first and foremost, no scientist. To say that he gives precedence to the evidence of the senses may mean no more than that he will not insist on anything that runs contrary to observed patterns. But it does not mean that his primary interest was in collecting the evidence of the senses. On the contrary, this mistaken procedure is the reason he criticizes those authorities mentioned above. Though it may seem strange to us to rebuke such men as Hesiod, Xenophanes, and Pythagoras as data gatherers, the point is clear. Much learning does not teach the mind. B. 40. Whatever the quality of that learning. Heraclitus elsewhere calls the senses poor witnesses for those whose souls cannot understand. Kakoi martures are the eyes and ears, runs the phrase, for those who have barbarus psychas. The souls of such men are literally barbarian, in that they do not understand the necessary language. Though there may also be a connotation of coarseness for philosophically unrefined souls not attuned to comprehension of the outside world. So men often fail to understand the universe not because they are not trying, but because they have been heading in the wrong direction, gathering exterior data, in contrast to Heraclitus, who says, I searched out myself. Edixe samen emeauton. But at the same time, the very universe seems to curl up into a question mark on inquiry. It loves to hide itself, fragment B, 123, and human failure to know is like the failure to solve a riddle. B, 56. We are quite far now from the universe that spread itself out for Milesian intellectual dissection. Where does all this confusion come from? Partly from where Heraclitus has said it comes from, our barbarian souls. We do not understand our language well enough, and the amount of wordplay in the surviving fragments shows how Heraclitus liked to pay attention to it. If the way we conceive of the world is traced in our way of talking about it, then some of the connections and contradictions of our view of the world may be made plain by examining our language. Heraclitus cites one contradiction which, to a man with an arrow through his chest, would have seemed a ghastly irony indeed. Bios, to un toxo onoma bios ergon de thanatos. The name of the bow is life, but its deed, death. There is one network of connections centering on the prefix xun, together, which is of some importance to Heraclitus. Xunos is crucial, and used to express the universality of the logos. tu logo deontos xunu, xdousin hoi poloi hos idian echontes pronesin. Though the logos is common, most men live as if they had a private reason. The phrases axunetos and xunoo pick out a connection between understanding and the essential unity of the universe. This connection is again pointed to in fragment B51. U xuniaisi okos diapheromenon heauto xumferetai. It means, literally, they do not piece together how brought apart it is brought together. And the two xun prefixes highlight the way our very knowledge must mirror the nature of the world. But the difficulty we often have with language is simply one aspect of the difficulty we have with the world. As Hussey puts it, language properly used is cryptic to the uninitiated, just as sense experience is. And our experience is bemusing indeed. Though we pass two distinct ways, we know that we have traveled only one road, as Heraclitus comments with Vatic spareness. Hodos ano kato mia kai ho te. The road up and down is one and the same. Nor is the style of the fragment besides the point. The road is so simple and obvious a metaphor for the progress of time as a whole, or of a single life, that a mention of it shorn of context must immediately begin to pile on meanings like layers of sediment. And it is the compression of so much symbolic mass into 6 small words that forms an apothegm of such great density. As Diogenes Laertius said more generally of Heraclitus, the brevity and weight of expression are incomparable. Part of what is meant by such expressions as density or weight is, I suppose, a sense that Heraclitus is raising questions of fundamental importance, and thus is not just uttering banalities about roads, though that the phrase is also a banality about roads is at the core of its force. The other thing that the term density gestures towards is the way in which these sentences are hard to break up. We cannot move in immediately to analyze and criticize them, which is, after all, the mark of a scientific style. The language is all in a knot, and we cannot untie it. Thalassa hudor katharotaton kai miarotaton is not a phrase to be routinely digested. Its closed, packed structure, a near repetition followed by a stark contradiction, means that it will sit some time in the mind's stomach. The fragment does go on to explain something of what Heraclitus was getting at, since, while for fish it, the seawater, is drinkable and healthy, for humans it is undrinkable and harmful. But the Greek again presses upon us Heraclitus' fascination with paradox. Ichthusi men potimon kai soterion, anthropois de apotimon kai olethron. The two contrasting pairs are set on either side of the men de clause, and there is the bald conflict of apotimon with potimon. What interested Heraclitus here was not the relativity of tastes or physiognomies, but, as the collection of similarly paradoxical fragments makes clear, the fact that single entities can be both one thing and another, however this happens. A more famous fragment redoubles the contradiction, stating, Potamois tois autois embainomen te kai uk embainomen, amen te kai uk amen. Here we have two phrases followed by their negation and strongly conjoined. Why not just kai instead of tekai? If Heraclitus were a kind of scientist, that fragment should have ruined his career. It does indeed break the law of non-contradiction, as Aristotle said. Indeed, it is crying out that it is breaking that law. Heraclitus' style has been discussed at length because it rubs our faces in what scholars have so often tried to keep their hands clean of, Heraclitus' mysticism. He insists on the contradictions and entanglements of word and world because they say something about how the world is, though this is not a physical comment, but a metaphysical one. I would call it a poetic statement, were the word not so debased. It is the statement that the world is united by its differences, another contradiction. Heraclitus has three main images to express this situation. The first is a river. Upon those that step into the same rivers, different and different waters flow, he says, and yet they remain the same rivers. The fragment above connects this statement about nature with a comment upon our own being. We are and we are not. We are changing constantly and yet remain the same people. Indeed, the fact that we can speak of rivers or of we at all reminds us that there are constants in the midst of change. For the supposition that Heraclitus did indeed extend the image of the mutability of the river to other things can alone make sense of the two phrases of fragment 49a. And it chimes with the ancient tradition that Heraclitus thought that pantare, Simplicius's words, or pantachore, Plato's. That phrase itself would have pleased Heraclitus. The neuter plural of flowing things embraced in the singular, unified process of the verb. The way a river remains a river, not despite of constant change, but because of it, is also an answer to the wider problem of how the world remains a unity despite its constituents, which seem to work by their very nature to pull it apart. Heraclitus answers again that what we perceive as a unity is not disturbed, but actually guaranteed by the opposing forces of the world. And he again uses an image to illustrate this. They, he says, perhaps those who would claim that pluralist and monist positions are irreconcilable, they do not apprehend how, being at variance, it agrees with itself. There is a back-stretched connection, as in the bow and the lyre. Palintropos harmoniae, hokosper toxu kai lures. The image is again richly layered. Both bow and lyre, instruments of war and music, are composite artifacts built out of opposing parts. The bow acts against the bowstring to form the bow, the lyre frame against the strings to form the lyre. But more subtly, the function and use of each object only emerges when it is pressed into extreme tension. A slack bow has the form of tension, but the arrow only fires when it is pressed into real tension. A silent lyre has a similar, near-symmetrical form, but only after what is, from an objective viewpoint, a chaotic strumming or plucking of the strings, bending them from their places, does a single stream of music arise. In each case, the phrase is tailored to fit what happens. A bow is indeed back-turning in relation to the arrow being fired, and harmonie, in the musical sense, does indeed emerge from the combination of different notes sounded on the lyre. So unity emerges again through difference. And yet it is worth noticing that, just as the river has a channel, both bow and lyre have frames set up by some personality or exterior force. Where does this come from? Heraclitus' third image comes closest of all to the real state of things and implies an answer to that question. That third image is struggle, war. War is father of all and king of all, he says. The image is modified and reduced to the smaller scale struggle of a game when Heraclitus says, Aion pais esti paisdon pasuon, paidos he basilie. Everlasting time is a child playing at backgammon. The kingdom is a child's. The word translated playing is paisdon, which echoes pais. The universe in the form of a child is being childish. Heraclitus ascribes a divine insouciance to the process of the universe, as well as to the ion, which seems to stand for the universe's guiding personality. An idle boy playing a game of Pesoi plays both sides, and it is in the nature of the game that both sides are opposed and irreconcilable. But that does not mean that the universe is thus finally divided. The intelligence of the player can make both sides merge in a unified game, while the fundamentally confrontational setup on the board remains unchanged. And here the question will again be asked: where does the board come from? Who supplies the pieces and sets the rules? Heraclitus' answer may be found in a fragment that seems to respond to the only surviving fragment of Anaximander. Existing things, Anaximander had said, pay penalty and retribution to each other according to the assessment of time. Kata ten tu chronu taxin. Heraclitus' view of the ordering of time is implied in his picture of eternity at play, but his reply to the very idea of a taxis of the universe is to say that one must know that war is general, xunon, and that justice is strife, and that all things come to be according to strife and necessity. So even the constraining laws of the universe emerge from war. Justice itself is strife. The struggle dictates how things will be, and this is just. And the strife is unending. And so the world is seen as an ever-flowing river, an artifact constructed around tension, or as war which generates its own laws. Such a picture serves no scientific need by describing a still greater number of phenomena in still more comprehensive terms. Instead, it serves a philosophical, even spiritual need by allowing us to conceive of the simultaneous unity and incorrigible plurality of the world as an intellectually satisfying thing. But there is a further level of explanation we have not reached. We have explained how there is one river, how the war generates its limits. But what is the war itself made of? What is the difference between the existence of the war of the world and its non-existence? This, again, is not a question of physics, but of metaphysics. But we think it is part of science, and our answer to the question, what is the difference between the existence of anything and the existence of nothing, would be energy, which is the same thing as mass. We think that the universe is of a constant quantity, and we express this in what we call the first law of thermodynamics, or the law of the conservation of energy. But what we mean by that is really no more than what Heraclitus meant by saying, all things are in equal exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as goods are for gold, and gold for goods. Or again, neither any god nor any man made this cosmos, but it always was, and always will be, an ever-living fire, being kindled in measures, and being quenched in measures. For this is Heraclitus' stuff of existence, fire. It may seem that he betrays his own conventionality in aping the Milesians and positing a basic element as the universe's original arche, or first principle. In fact, nothing shows us Heraclitus' distance from the Milesians more clearly than his use of fire. Firstly, as the passage above demonstrates, pur, fire, is not an arche, but an eternal principle, ais doon. It is not something to be reduced or explained, it is simply the nature of things that it is, and we can inquire no further. The Milesians' very project was to explain as many of the highly complex phenomena of the universe in as mundane terms as possible. Water and air are materials we see all around us, and seem so simple so as to not need explaining, as against, say, two divinities creating worlds by making love, which is something we don't see very often. Fire is different, because it is not so mundane. It is already complex and energetic to the point that we might call it alive, which Heraclitus does call it. The word translated above as always alive, is eos doon. And the human soul is itself fiery, just as the cosmos is itself alive. In fragment 36, the word suke even seems to take the place of pur in account of the transformation of the elements. But it is in another way that fire is most essential to the nature of things, in its aspect as the perfect symbol of flux. For fire itself is a constant streaming, a constant flowering through destruction. As such, it underlies all processes in the universe, not as the essential substance, but as the essential process. The way this metaphysical fire can be said to be all things and all processes is, at one stage, likened to the way that fire, when it is mixed with spices, is named according to the scent of each of them. And in the same fragment, God is seen as what is, like fire, common to the universe's essentially unified opposites. God, says Heraclitus, is day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, hunger. Such is Heraclitus's view of the world. Like language, the world is confusing, until we realize that its contrasts and oppositions do not detract from its unity, but form it. At the heart of the whole process is a crackling fire. We say it is energy, a scientist's word. It is Heraclitus who has the better image. At the final level of explanation, we must step back, like primitive man, from the heat of the complex, flowing, living fire. And this is meat. For even to delimit the structure of the world is to explain as much as we can, and yet so little. No one really knows on what fuel the fire burns. No one knows where the arrow will fall or strike. No one will ever hear the lyre's music. So, says Wittgenstein, people stop short at natural laws as at something unassailable, as did the ancients at God. And they are both right and wrong. But the ancients were clearer insofar as they recognized one clear terminus, whereas the modern system makes it appear as though everything were explained.